What happens when the most powerful man in the world is left with only silence? No cameras, no advisors, just one question echoing in his mind. Did I ever truly believe? Tonight, Bill Clinton breaks his silence, not about politics, but about faith, failure, and the one story from the Bible that changed everything. This is not the Clinton you think you know. He once stood at the center of the world, cheered by millions, challenged by history, surrounded by power. But tonight he is alone, just a man, and a story not yet fully told. The soft hum of memory echoes through the silence. Somewhere beyond the stillness of the frame, the halls of Arkansas whisper with the voices of another time. Small-town churches, the creak of worn wooden pews, and the smell of old hymnals. This is where Bill Clinton's story begins, not with politics, but with faith. The kind of faith that was whispered in prayers at dusk and sung in gospel choirs on humid Sunday mornings. My grandmother used to say, Clinton recalls, his voice low, faith ain't just about belief, it's about direction. But direction isn't always clear when the world offers so many roads. For a boy raised between hardship and promise, faith was a map without landmarks, a compass handed down with more questions than answers. He remembers watching the grown-ups at the back of the room, nodding as the preacher thundered. He never doubted their conviction, only whether he could feel it the same way. Not yet, not with so many dreams pulling him forward, away from pews and into podiums. I wanted to fix things, he once said, but somewhere along the way, I started wondering what fixing really meant. The photo doesn't move, but in the stillness, you can almost see it. The weight of memory, the flicker of regret. Not about politics, about moments missed, conversations never had, a version of himself that believed power alone could heal the world. Faith, he whispers, has always been the thing I avoided when I needed it most. It wasn't scandal or impeachment that broke him open. It was quieter than that. A night alone, a letter he never sent, a Bible collecting dust on a shelf in Chappaqua. He didn't open it to find answers. He opened it because nothing else made sense. Not anymore. He read slowly, like a man trying to remember a language he once spoke fluently, long ago. Stories he'd heard in his youth now hit differently, especially one, the woman caught in adultery. The silence of Jesus in that story haunted him. He didn't condemn. He didn't excuse. He just knelt down. Clinton paused when he reached that line, sat back, thought about all the times he'd failed to kneel, to pause, to listen. That was the beginning, he says now. Not of religion, of reckoning. This isn't the Clinton the world remembers, the one with the confident grin and soaring rhetoric. This is a man at the edge of his life, asking if any of it mattered, if any of it meant something. I used to believe faith was for the weak. Now I think it's the only thing that ever made me strong. The camera doesn't move, but the story does. From the dusty roads of Arkansas to the marble floors of Washington, and back again. Not for applause, not for legacy, for truth. It's not too late to start over, he says softly, even for me. And with that, the silence returns. The stillness deepens. But the reckoning has only just begun. He stood on the world stage, but his questions were always whispered in the dark. Bill Clinton had known pressure. From his earliest days in Little Rock to the Oval Office, it came in waves, cameras flashing, crowds chanting, headlines roaring. But no microphone ever caught the quietest moments, the ones where he was alone, wrestling not with policy, but with purpose. He remembers one night late, lights off, alone in the residence, the world outside buzzing with scandal, betrayal, and shame. His name dragged across every screen, and in his hand the crumpled photo. Hillary, Chelsea. Before it all became complicated, I asked God a question that night, he says, but not out loud. I was too afraid of the answer. The question was simple. Am I still the man they believe in? Or have I become the man they warned about? Faith, for Clinton, had never been a campaign slogan, but neither had it been a compass. Not really. Not when the stakes were high. Not when compromise came easier than confession. I'd speak at churches, he admits, but I rarely felt worthy to sit in the back pew. But that night something cracked. Not publicly. Not politically. But spiritually, he opened a Bible again, not to read, but to remember what grace even felt like. He landed in Psalm 51. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. That line didn't shout. It whispered. He read it twice, then 3 times, then closed the book and wept, not because he feared judgment, but because he feared emptiness, that all the years of striving, persuading, and winning had somehow left him hollow. I built a mountain, Ted, he once said in a private interview, but I forgot the foundation. Power without grounding, strategy without soul. That was the crossroads. And he stood there, not as president, but as a man with nowhere else to turn. And then the letter came. From a stranger, a pastor in South Carolina. No judgment, no politics, just a single sentence. Even King David fell, Mr. President, but God still called him a man after his own heart. It hit Clinton like a thunderclap. Not absolution, invitation, not you're forgiven, but you're still called. That's when I knew, he says now, his voice breaking slightly. Faith doesn't erase failure, it redefines it. Since then, he stopped trying to outrun his past. He's tried instead to understand what it taught him. Not how to lead a nation, but how to live with himself, how to be present, how to listen for the quiet voice beneath the chaos. I don't want my legacy to be perfect, he says. I want it to be honest. There's no crowd now, no press briefing, just the sound of one man, choosing to stop running, standing still at the crossroads, and finally, turning home. Faith without action is just philosophy, and philosophy doesn't rebuild broken lives. After his presidency, the motorcade stopped. The spotlight faded. But for Bill Clinton, something unexpected began. Not a return to power, but a return to people. He had spent decades debating policy, designing systems, shaking hands. But for the first time, he started asking different questions. Not what does America need, but what does this person need right now? That shift began in Harlem. It wasn't a strategic move. It wasn't even popular at first. But something drew him there. The rhythm of the streets, the resilience of the people, and the undeniable presence of need, not just economic, but emotional, spiritual. One afternoon, he recalls, I met a woman outside a food pantry. She didn't want a photo. She wanted a coat. It stopped him, not because he didn't have one to give, but because it reminded him how easily we forget the weight of another person's life. Later that week, Clinton found himself volunteering, quietly, anonymously, sorting donations, wiping tables, listening to stories that didn't make the evening news. That's when a local pastor approached him and said something he'd never forget. Mr. President, the Good Samaritan didn't lead a government program. He just showed up. Clinton went home and read the parable again, slowly, not as literature, but as instruction. He saw the man, Clinton murmured, and he stopped. 2 words that haunted him. He stopped. In all his years of leadership, how often had he stopped? He thought of the single mother in Baton Rouge, whose house he'd visited after a flood, of the young ex-convict in Chicago learning to code, of the rural families in West Virginia without clean water. They weren't policy points. They were neighbors, and he began to understand something he hadn't in all his time at the podium. The measure of a man's faith, he says now, is how often he's willing to get his hands dirty. So he did. Quiet hospital visits, untelevised food drives, anonymous donations, not because it made headlines, but because it made sense. That's when the Samaritan test came. One winter morning, he received a letter from an old political rival. The man was dying. Regret filled every line. And at the end, a plea. Would you come? There was no debate. Clinton flew out the next day. He sat beside the bed of the man who'd once tried to destroy him on the campaign trail. He held his hand. He prayed. He forgave. We don't get to choose who needs grace, Clinton said afterward. We only get to decide whether we'll offer it. That was the Samaritan test. Not theology, not image, just a question, will you stop? And on that day, in that moment, Bill Clinton did. Forgiveness is easy to admire until it's your turn to give it. There are some wounds that never make the headlines, betrayals too personal to become public scandal, words whispered behind closed doors, alliances broken not with malice, but with ambition. Bill Clinton remembers those faces. Former allies turned critics. Senators who once smiled beside him, then watched silently as his legacy trembled under weight he alone had to carry. But what haunts him most isn't what they did. It's what he almost became in response. There was a time, he admits, when I let bitterness set the terms, when my prayers ended with, "And strike them down, Lord." He laughs, but the pain behind it lingers. Then came a moment that tested him. Years after leaving office, he was invited to speak at a funeral of a man who had, years earlier, publicly condemned him, brutally, on the floor of the Senate. In interviews, in speeches that made headlines, Clinton hesitated, declined, then sat in silence, staring at the invitation on his desk. And in his mind, a verse returned, one he'd once ignored, but now couldn't escape. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Matthew 5 verse 44. He went, not for the cameras, not for closure, but because he realized something vital. Faith isn't proven in prayer, it's proven in presence. He stood at the podium that day and spoke not of old wounds, but of shared hopes. He told stories of their early years in politics, of battles fought and mutual respect once shared. No bitterness, no score settling. Afterward, the man's son approached him, tears in his eyes. He never stopped respecting you, he said. He just forgot how to say it. That moment cracked something open in Clinton. He began to reach out, quietly. Letters, phone calls, not rehearsed speeches, just words like, "I forgive you." Or sometimes harder, "Will you forgive me?" I thought I had to protect my legacy, he reflects. But it turns out, what needed protecting was my soul. It wasn't always welcomed. Some never replied. Some hung up. But some, surprisingly, answered. There was the former advisor he'd cut off after a betrayal, a journalist he'd once threatened to sue, even a former political opponent whose name still sent ripples through his party. To each, he extended not just an olive branch, but something more rare in modern life, repentance. It wasn't weakness, Clinton says. It was strength I didn't know I had. The kind that Jesus modeled, not in thrones or temples, but in washing the feet of those who would deny him. That image of the Son of God kneeling before his betrayer stayed with Clinton. That, he whispers, is the most powerful act in human history, and the most painful to imitate. But he tried, because in the end, redemption doesn't come from rewriting your past. It comes from owning it and offering others a way forward. I may never be remembered as a saint, he says, but I hope I'll be remembered as a man who learned how to forgive before it was too late. And with that, the former president bows his head, not in shame, but in peace. Some legacies are carved in marble. Others are carried in silence. Bill Clinton knows the world won't remember everything. Not every policy. Not every scandal. Not every speech. Time has a way of editing even the loudest lives into whispers. And he's made peace with that. Because legacy, he's come to believe, isn't what the world says when you're gone. It's what people feel when they remember you. The kindnesses, the turning points, the light. We all leave something behind, he says. The only question is, what kind of weight will it carry? He remembers walking through a town in Haiti after an earthquake. Rubble all around. Homes gone. Grief thick in the air. A little girl approached him, not to ask for food or shelter, but to hand him a flower. A real one. Somehow still growing in the dust. She said, "This is for my mom. She says you came back." Most people never do. That flower dried up days later, but he kept it. It sits in his Bible to this day, because that moment reminded him, the world doesn't need heroes. It needs people who stay, who show up, who return, even after failure, especially after failure. Faith isn't about being unshakable, he reflects. It's about coming back to the light, even after you've lost your way. These days, he spends less time speaking and more time listening. Less time in the spotlight, more time in prayer. And his prayers have changed. He no longer prays to be great. He prays to be good. Not to be remembered, but to be used. If I have one more day, he says, I want it to matter to someone else. Not a crowd, not a nation, just one person, because that's what Jesus modeled, not mass movements, but mustard seeds, not grand gestures, but everyday grace. Let your light shine, he said, not so they see you, but so they see him. That's the legacy Clinton wants now. Not fame, not forgiveness, but fruit. The kind of legacy that lives on in the child who believes again, in the neighbor who forgives again, in the leader who listens again. I used to chase history, he says, a gentle smile forming. Now I'm just trying to follow Jesus. The light through the window grows softer now, and for the first time in a long time, he looks at peace. Not because his story is perfect, but because his heart is finally full. If you like the video, don't forget to subscribe and press the like button.